One thing I want to say about European history that is somewhat unique that you don't always find in the history of other places. You can find a lot of abuses in the West, when you study Western history. But I challenge any one of you to find an abuse that wasn't followed quickly by a call for reform. Now, in other parts of the world, you might have what we call an abuse. I mean, in some parts of the world, they consider women to be property. In some parts of the world, they kill their girl babies. In other parts of the world, they have a system that enslaves a big segment of the population. Well, you might say, didn't we have that in our country? Was there ever a call for reform? Yes, it's true, Westerners went into Africa and stole the African people from Africa, but there was a call for reform. It's difficult. In fact, I've never seen it. In my years of studying Western history, I can't find any form of abuse that wasn't at some point followed by somebody calling for reform or change. All right, we left off this class last Thursday with Henry VIII. I'm looking at page 429. Anyway, Henry VIII divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, to marry Jane Seymour. And shortly after the marriage, they had a daughter named Elizabeth. Henry still didn't have the male heir that he wanted. But after a short while, Henry got tired of Jane Seymour, married a third wife who finally bore him a male heir. All told, Henry was to have 6 wives. He killed 2 of them, including Jane Seymour. But I'm sorry about the names Jane Seymour. Pardon me, it's Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn. I've gotten one wife mixed up with another. He had a bunch of them. The wife's name, the second wife, was Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth, the first mother, was Anne Boleyn. And Anne Boleyn was the one he had killed shortly after, not too long after they were married. Now, when Henry died, he bypassed his 2 older daughters. He said Mary was illegitimate, even though she wasn't, but he claimed Mary was illegitimate. He said Elizabeth also was illegitimate. The Catholic Church would have agreed with him on that point. He bypassed his 2 older daughters and put his young son on the throne, the boy king Edward, who is sometimes known as the boy king or the sickly king. Edward got the throne, he was 9 years old and only lived 6 years, died, I believe, shortly after his 16th birthday, died quite young. But under Edward, some people took over and made England more Protestant than it had been, or they broke England farther from the Catholic Church. Then, a little side note here. If you ever hear the story of the Prince and the Pauper, about the prince who wandered off from the castle and wanted to find out how the other half lived, that story is based in part on Edward, who is the prince whose father was king of England, and met up with a pauper, and supposedly he and the pauper exchanged places because they looked alike. Now, this story is pure fiction, but nevertheless, it was based on a little bit of reality. These kings oftentimes dress as ordinary persons and roam the countryside, wondering what it's like to live the life of an ordinary person. Anyway, The Prince and the Pauper is based in part on the life of Edward before he became king. Anyway, Edward died. When Edward died, Lady Jane Grey got the throne for 9 days. Lady Jane Grey was executed. Lady Jane Grey more or less usurped the throne. And the throne went to Mary, sometimes known as Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary was determined to return England back to Protestantism. Back, no, I'm getting all mixed up. Bloody Mary was determined to return England back to Catholicism. She got the name Bloody because she killed some 300 Protestant leaders, including Thomas Cranmer, who had led the Anglican Church away from Catholicism. She killed some 300 Protestant leaders. In addition, she married Prince Philip of Spain, who was very unpopular in England. The marriage was a disaster. Yes. She married Philip of Spain, the Crown Prince of Spain, who was the idea behind a lot of these political marriages was to unite the thrones. In other words, if they would have had any children, their child would have inherited the throne of both England and Spain. Problem was, Mary could not conceive children. Now today's doctors have read what we know about the symptoms she experienced, and some of today's doctors believe that they could have cured her ailments and enabled her to have children. But as it is, Mary could not have children. And eventually, her husband deserted her. And she had a very unhappy time on the throne and finally died unwanted and childless. And even after killing 300 Protestant leaders, at the end of her reign, her country, England, was more Protestant than it had been before. Which brings us up to Elizabeth. The present Queen of England calls herself Elizabeth II. The reason she's called II is because after Mary, Mary's half-sister took the throne. Now, when Mary's half-sister Elizabeth took the throne, the Pope said to her, "You're illegitimate and you have no right to the throne." Yes? This is Elizabeth I. Today's queen is Elizabeth II.
Oh, okay.
The present queen is Elizabeth II. She calls herself II because this one back here in the 1500s was the first Elizabeth. So this one, the one on the phone today, is Elizabeth II. Anyway, the Pope said the Catholic Church never sanctioned your father's marriage to your mother, and besides, we know you were conceived while your father was still married to Catherine. Therefore, you're illegitimate. You have no right to the throne. Well, in the meantime, the Protestants said, oh yes, you're legitimate. The Church of England did sanction your father's marriage to Anne Boleyn, your mother. Therefore, you are legitimate, and you do have a right to the throne. Therefore, Elizabeth, in order to become Queen of England, had to become a Protestant. She was nominally, on the surface, a Protestant. It is believed that deep down at heart, she was a Catholic. But what she did that benefited both sides was she taught Catholic and Protestant that they could live together in harmony and unity. She persecuted neither side. She did not try to make England a Protestant country. She did not try to make England a Catholic country. Both sides lived together. We're going to come back to Elizabeth later. Right now, I'm keeping in with a book. The book goes on from talking about Mary to talking about a special group of people called the Anabaptists. Now, today's Baptist Church, which, if I'm not mistaken, is the largest denomination here in the southern part of the United States, at least in the southeast, today's Baptist Church claim that they are an offshoot from the Anabaptist. The Anabaptists were a more radical group, persecuted by both sides, hated by Catholic and Protestant. The Lutherans didn't like them, the Anglicans didn't like them, the Catholics didn't. They had some beliefs that today we would consider almost the norm, but in those days they were radical. They said that religion should be a matter of individual choice and not a matter of following the footsteps of the king. that each person should have the freedom of conscience to decide which church he would belong to, or even if he would belong or not belong. They believed in separation of church and state. And they believed that each church should have the freedom to choose its own minister and not have a minister sent to them by some government agency higher up. Now, all these may seem like normal beliefs to most of us, but in those days, they were extremely radical. And they were soundly persecuted, regarded as dangerous. And if you read further about them, you might read that at some point, some of them were persecuted. All right, if a man did not swear, if he did not abuse his children, did not beat his wife, he could be killed as an Anabaptist because he was probably one of them. The Catholics and Lutheran both swore. The Lutherans often worse than the Catholics. Well, if you read Martin Luther's literature, you'd better, if you're sensitive at all, you'd better kind of be ready to close your eyes, because his literature has a whole lot of words in them that some people would consider offensive. The Anabaptists also believed it was wrong to serve in the army, because the army killed people, so it was wrong to kill even in time of war. Your Mennonites, Quakers, Moravians, some of these groups are offshoots from Anabaptists. At first they tended to live in communes off to themselves, but eventually some of them at least joined into the mainstream and tried to fit into the mainstream society. And a lot of them found their way into the English colonies, the 13 colonies, and a bunch of them eventually found their way into Georgia. And they were quite influential in setting up the Constitution because of their emphasis. I mean, they told the founding fathers, make sure you separate church from state, and all money to the church should, all money that goes to church should come from voluntary contributions. The state should not give the church any money. Again, all this may sound like the norm today, but it was radical for the time. All right, what was the social impact of the Protestant Reformation? Protestant Reformation made some changes. The sale of indulgences was stopped. Eventually, the Catholics saw the light on that and outlawed the sale of indulgences. Protestantism abolished monasticism and a celibate clergy. In other words, the Protestants have no monks and no nuns, and their clergy are allowed to marry. The picture of a Protestant minister coming to church, leading along his wife and a string of children behind him, that was started by Martin Luther and has continued among Protestant ministers to this day. Your book says one thing, though, that did not change. The husband was looked on as being the head of the house, and the wife was expected to be obedient, like an obedient servant, whose chief duty was to please her husband. And like as in the case of Catholics, the wife was also to bear the children. There were a few things, though, that also changed among the Catholics, which we'll talk about in the next under the term Catholic Reformation. When the Catholics saw that they were losing a lot of their numbers to Protestants, they began to hold a Reformation also. And this Reformation is sometimes called the Counter-Reformation. Or Catholic Reformation. As I've already mentioned, one feature of it was the sale of indulgences was stopped. One other issue that they dealt with was the issue of the worship of saints. The Catholics had had a saint for every day of the year, and in some cases, some days of the year had 2 saints. Eventually, most of these saints' days disappeared from the calendar. And today there are very few of them left. Actually, in the case of the saints, when the saints were taken from the calendar, most people didn't even miss them. The saints' days were allowed to stay on as long as the followers of those saints were alive. But then as the followers of this saint more or less died off, and the follower of that saint died off, all these saints' days disappeared from the calendar. Now, there are 3 saints' days, folk, you might be aware, that still are on the calendar. I'll name them. This won't be on the test, but they are St. Valentine's Day, St. Patrick's Day, and St. Nicholas's Day. St. Nicholas's Day is December 25th. But December 12th, otherwise known as Christmas Day. But we still think of St. Valentine's Day on February 14th, St. Patrick, the patron saint of Ireland, on March 17th. And, of course, St. Nicholas, we sing about him and think about him on December 25th, actually for about a month before that. The emphasis on relics was greatly curtailed. Again, not many people mourned the loss of the relics. A lot of persons had ceased to venerate them anyway, even among the Catholics. So the saints' relics largely disappeared. Now, the issue of marriage, up until this time, Catholics had looked on celibacy, that is, a life completely without sex, as being preferred to a married life. They changed that and said that the life of celibacy was no better than, but equal to, married life. No, they still did not allow their clergy to marry. Their monks and nuns still not allowed to marry. And that is still true in 2014. But among the laity, they said that the laity were free to marry as they wished, and that would not count against them as far as they would not be considered less holy or less righteous if they married than it would be if they did not. Among the events that occurred was the formation of a new society called the Jesuits. They were founded by Loyola. Loyola was wounded in the leg by a sword wound. The sword wound hit him pretty hard, and the cut went deep. And it took him weeks to recover. In those days, they didn't have the surgery that we have today or the means of fast recovery. And he said his recovery was an extremely painful time, that he bore a lot of pain. But eventually, he recovered the use of his leg and recovered from his battle wound. And once recovered, he formed a Society of Jesus called the Jesuits. And their express goal was, well, they had several goals. Goal number 1 was to missionize unconverted people, and number 2 was to eradicate all Protestantism. They took a vow to destroy all Protestants.
They were Catholic.
The Jesuits was a Catholic order. The most famous of the L-O-Y, it's L-O-Y-O-L-A. The most famous of the Jesuits was Xavier. And any of you who follow college basketball or college sports, I mean, you may have heard of schools named after this man and schools named after this man. There in Cincinnati, near Cincinnati at least, there's a Catholic college called Xavier University. Xavier was responsible for carrying the Christianity into the regions of the Far East, China, Japan, Korea, and a couple of chapters. On chapter 17, we'll talk about how much success he had and something about how many converts he made. The papacy decided it had to change also, and they finally got a pope called the Reformed Pope, Pope Paul III. These personal dates they give are the dates of birth that Paul III was Pope, not the dates of his birth and death. He was the one who organized the Jesuits, and he called the Council of Trent. Now again, to give you some idea about how times were different, during my lifetime, and when I was still a teenager, Pope John the 23rd called an ecumenical council. The council met, they had jet aircraft that could get these people to the council, and they met for a few months and then went home. But the Council of Trent lasted on and off again for a period of more than 20 years. They'd meet, then disassemble, meet again and disassemble, and meet and then disassemble. But what came out of the Council of Trent was, by the time it was over, the Catholic Church finally wrote down its doctrine. I mean, before that, the doctrine had more or less somewhat been made up as they went along, but they finally defined their doctrine. And then once they defined their doctrine, they were ready to go out and fight for it. All right, and then the book goes, and I'm going to follow the book. The book goes on describing some of the main countries in Europe, starting with France and going from there to Spain and from there to England. In the case of France, French Protestants were called Huguenots, named after Hugo. I can never remember how to spell that name. Named after Hugo. Now, if you say, I've never heard of the Huguenots, that's not surprising. There are no Huguenots today. In American history, some of our American founding fathers were descended from the Huguenots, including Paul Revere. Paul Revere's ancestor is known to have been Huguenot. But the Huguenots eventually found their way into Holland or England or even to what is today the United States. And they've joined other churches, particularly the Dutch Reformed Church or the Baptist Church or even the Church of England. They joined other Protestant movements because they were eventually driven out of France. Now here's the situation you had in France at this time. The dates we're talking about is the mid-1500s or so. Only about 3% of France were Protestant. But of that 3%, 40% of the nobility was Protestant. And the royal house was Catholic, but waiting in the wings in case the royal line did not produce a male heir was the House of Bourbon, which was known to be Protestant. So a high plurality of the nobility was in fact Protestant. So this led a lot of people in France to fear that France was about to become a Protestant country. Eventually, the royal house of France, the throne became vacant. The king had no male heir, and a member from the House of Bourbon took the throne, Henry of Navarre. But Henry of Navarre, who had been born a Protestant, decided to become Catholic, giving the famous words, and these are not in your book, but Paris is well worth a mass. He became Catholic, but during his time, during Henry's time, there was no persecution of Catholic and Protestant, and Catholic and Protestant learned they could seemingly get along side by side together. Now, folk, I wish I could say this was the way it ended. Unfortunately, this is the way it ends for the reign of Henry of Navarre. But then as you go on in the story, we'll find that in the long run, France was to become a Catholic country and were to drive out all Protestants. And also they were to go through a terrible revolution where the king and queen both lost their heads. But that's jumping ahead of the story a little bit. And again, the whole revolution might have been prevented had they allowed the religious freedom or religious toleration to begin with. The Edict of Nantes now, in the French, any of you have taken French, know that I'm not pronouncing these things the way they spell because it's not pronounced the way it's spelled. Anyway, the Edict of Nantes granted religious toleration to Huguenot and Catholic alike. That was, the edict was signed by Henry, King Henry IV of France. And as long as he was on the throne, there was toleration. Unfortunately, Henry could not live forever. All right, we'll come back to France. Meantime, we'll move on to Spain.